I never expected my teacher's sister to show up at my door and say she already knew all about me. The afternoon sunlight spilled lazily across the wooden floor, warm and golden, as I sat on the edge of my bed, half absorbed in a book I had promised myself I'd finish weeks ago. The quiet of my apartment was comforting, almost meditative, and I was just settling into that rare feeling of being completely alone when a knock at the door cut through the stillness. It was neither urgent nor loud, just deliberate, the kind that makes you pause and consider who might be visiting at this hour. I frowned, a little unsettled. Visitors weren't usual, not in the middle of a weekday. With a reluctant sigh, I set the book aside, its pages softly whispering as they closed, and padded toward the door. Peering through the peephole, I froze for a moment. She was there. My teacher's sister. There was a quiet grace to her that didn't rely on loud gestures or flashy smiles. It was in the way she stood, relaxed but confident, the sunlight catching the subtle highlights in her hair. Her eyes held a warmth that made it impossible to look away, and there was an air about her, a combination of ease and elegance, that seemed to make the room itself feel smaller, more intimate. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice smooth, calm, and unexpectedly comforting. Even before I opened the door fully, the faint scent of her perfume, soft, floral, and somehow nostalgic, drifted into the hallway. It was a scent that seemed to fit her perfectly, mature without being overpowering, inviting without being presumptuous. I stepped aside, suddenly aware of how ordinary my surroundings felt compared to her presence. No, not at all," I managed, my voice sounding oddly loud in the quiet hall. She smiled, a slow, effortless curve of her lips that somehow put me immediately at ease. "I just wanted to drop something off," she said, holding a small package delicately in her hands. Her fingers brushed mine for just a fraction of a second as she handed it over. The contact was fleeting, but electric in the most subtle way, enough to make my chest tighten slightly. As I closed the door behind her, the familiar hum of the city outside was now punctuated by the quiet intensity of her presence. I found myself studying the small details, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the soft creases in her shirt as she shifted her weight, the calm patience in her posture. She seemed at once completely natural and deliberately attentive, a paradox that drew me in before I even realized it. For a moment there was silence, not uncomfortable, but expectant, like the pause before something significant begins. I could feel a curious tension in the air, one that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with proximity and unspoken recognition. My mind raced with questions I couldn't bring myself to voice. Why had she come? How much did she really know about me? And most unexpectedly, why did her presence make me feel both nervous and inexplicably alive? And just like that, the ordinary afternoon had shifted. What started as a quiet, uneventful day had turned into a moment charged with subtle anticipation, a moment that, I suspected, would linger far longer than the visit itself. After the brief, charged moment at the door, she settled herself in the living room, perching lightly on the arm of my couch as if she belonged there. I couldn't help but notice how natural she seemed in my space, moving with the quiet confidence of someone entirely at ease in the world. She glanced around casually, her eyes catching on small details, the stack of books by my bedside, the mug I'd left on the coffee table, the way the sunlight hit the corner of the room, and her soft smile made it feel like she was seeing all of it, and yet none of it, all at once. "So," she began, tilting her head in that subtle, observant way that made me feel like I had just been seen through a lens I hadn't known existed. "Your teacher told me about you." The words were light, conversational, but the way she said them carried an unspoken weight, a kind of teasing curiosity that made my pulse spike. I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to laugh nervously, part of me wanted to shrink back into the couch cushions. "Oh, she did?" I managed, keeping my voice steady, though my hands fidgeted slightly with the edge of a throw pillow. Her smile deepened, gentle but knowing. "Yes. She mentioned your quiet stubbornness, and your habit of overthinking things." She leaned forward just a little, enough for her presence to fill the space around me, and the faint scent of her perfume, soft, almost like vanilla with a hint of jasmine, drifted closer, grounding and teasing at the same time. There was an ease to her, the kind of ease that made conversation feel like a dance. Every glance, every tilt of her head, every subtle shift in her posture seemed deliberate yet natural, drawing me in without a word. I found myself wanting to respond more, to match the cadence of her voice, to somehow meet the level of attention she gave so effortlessly. "You seem thoughtful," she said after a pause, tilting her head just slightly. Her words weren't a compliment, not exactly, but they weren't casual either. They hung in the air between us, warm and expectant. I noticed the brief brush of her fingers against my arm as she gestured toward a mug of tea I had left nearby. The contact was fleeting, unintentional perhaps, but it left a curious warmth lingering long after she moved away. I realized, slowly, that her presence had changed the energy of the room entirely. It wasn't just that she was here, it was that she seemed to notice everything about me, in a way no one else ever had. The quiet spark of attention, the teasing undertone in her voice, the subtle way she let herself linger near me, all of it made the ordinary act of conversation feel intimate. And yet, there was restraint. Nothing was forced. Nothing was too forward. Every glance, every smile, every small touch carried just enough weight to make the silence between our words heavy, charged with unspoken questions and possibilities. I couldn't tell if she was aware of the effect she had on me, or if she was simply herself. Either way, I found myself leaning a little closer, unconsciously matching her quiet attentiveness, caught between curiosity and caution, and realizing that the ordinary afternoon I had expected was now far from ordinary. After a few minutes of easy conversation, the atmosphere between us shifted subtly. It was no longer just curiosity and polite small talk, something quieter, deeper, had begun to take shape. She leaned back slightly, her gaze softening as though she were choosing her words carefully, and began to speak of herself in a way that was casual, yet intimate. "I've been living in the same city for years," she said, her voice low and thoughtful. "But sometimes it feels like I'm just passing through." She shrugged lightly, a faint crease forming between her brows, and I caught the almost imperceptible tremor in her fingers as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. I was struck by the contrast between her outward confidence and this quiet vulnerability. She had always seemed so self-assured, almost untouchable in her composure, but now there was a flicker of humanity there that made her feel startlingly real. I felt a pull, an instinct to reach out, to acknowledge the weight she carried, even in this small, ordinary moment. "I get that sometimes," I admitted, my voice softer than I expected. "Even when everything seems fine on the outside, it can feel like there's this quiet emptiness inside." My words sounded fragile, almost like I was exposing a part of myself I didn't usually share. She looked at me then, really looked, and her eyes softened further, as if she had been waiting for someone to understand without needing explanations. "Exactly," she said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "It's nice to know someone else feels the same way, even just a little." For a brief moment, our hands brushed as I reached for a sugar packet on the table. The touch was casual, accidental, but it lingered longer than expected. I could feel the warmth of her skin through the thin ceramic of the mug she held, and the steady, unspoken acknowledgement in her glance sent a small shiver down my spine. It was an electric, fleeting intimacy, the kind that leaves you aware of every detail, the rise and fall of her shoulders, the softness of her laughter, the quiet cadence of her breathing. We spent the next few minutes talking in this delicate rhythm, sharing thoughts about ordinary things, favorite books, childhood memories, small regrets. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken connection forming, a sense that we were looking into each other's emotional landscapes, reflecting vulnerabilities and curiosities we rarely showed anyone else. At one point, she paused mid-sentence, her gaze drifting to the window as sunlight glinted off her hair, and I noticed the slight tension in her hands, the subtle bite of her lip as if she were debating whether to say more. I felt an almost instinctual desire to ease her hesitation, to bridge the space between us with reassurance. It was a strange, beautiful sensation, the recognition of shared solitude and the quiet intimacy of understanding someone on a level beyond words. I realized then that this wasn't just a casual visit anymore. It was the beginning of something emotionally significant. And in that moment, as our laughter mingled with silences that spoke volumes, I understood that the real connection was not in what we said, but in the simple, human acknowledgement of each other's inner lives, a connection that could, if nurtured, grow into something far more profound. The afternoon stretched on, and our conversation naturally drifted into a shared activity, something small, mundane, yet intimate in the way it forced us to exist side by side. She suggested we look through a stack of old photographs I had promised myself I'd sort, or maybe organize a few books that had been leaning precariously on the shelves for months. It wasn't particularly romantic in the traditional sense, but the proximity, the subtle motions, and the soft tension in the air made it electric. As we crouched side by side on the floor, her shoulder occasionally brushing against mine, I became acutely aware of every small movement. The faint warmth where our knees met, the whisper of her fingers as they flipped through pages or nudged a photo into place, it all felt magnified. My chest tightened in a way I wasn't entirely prepared for, a mixture of nervousness, anticipation, and something tenderly thrilling. "Careful with that one," she said softly, her hand hovering briefly over mine as if to steady it. The contact was unintentional, fleeting, yet it lingered in my awareness far longer than it physically lasted. I caught the subtle scent of her perfume again, a faint trace of jasmine and warm vanilla, drifting close enough to make my senses keenly attuned to her presence. She laughed lightly at something in a photograph, the sound warm and intimate, echoing softly in the quiet room. I noticed the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the curve of her lips as she smiled, the way her hair fell just so across her face when she bent forward. Every detail seemed amplified, every small gesture loaded with unspoken emotion. At one point, as we reached for the same book simultaneously, our hands brushed. It was a gentle, casual touch, yet it sent an unexpected warmth up my arm. Our eyes met, and she gave me a brief, knowing smile, not teasing, not flirtatious overtly, but something that made my stomach twist with quiet excitement. There was a subtle acknowledgement in that look, a silent communication that neither of us had to voice. Time seemed to stretch in those quiet moments. The world outside faded to a soft blur, leaving only the two of us, side by side, leaning in just enough to feel each other's presence, yet careful not to overstep. Even as we laughed, shared thoughts, or paused to admire a photograph, there was an unspoken tension, a delicate balance of comfort and desire, curiosity and restraint. I realized then that proximity alone had become a language between us. Every lean, every brush of clothing, every fleeting touch carried meaning far beyond the words we exchanged. I was intensely aware of the warmth radiating from her, the quiet steadiness of her breathing, and the subtle shifts in her posture as she navigated the space between intimacy and propriety. By the time we finished the task, my chest felt full with a mixture of exhilaration and calm. There was no dramatic declaration, no overt confession, only the deep, unspoken awareness that we were no longer merely acquaintances in a quiet afternoon. We were two people exploring the delicate territory of closeness, each touch, each glance, each shared silence building a quiet tension that promised something more, something profoundly intimate, if only we allowed it to unfold naturally. The room had settled into a comfortable rhythm, quiet moments punctuated by light conversation, the occasional shared laugh, the soft shuffle of books and papers between us. I felt unusually aware of her presence, the way the space seemed to contract slightly whenever she leaned closer, the faint warmth radiating from her arm brushing mine, the subtle sway of her hair as she turned to look at a photograph. It was in these small, almost imperceptible details that the tension between us simmered, gentle but undeniable. Then she spoke softly, as if testing the air around us. "You know, your sister. I mean, your teacher, she told me about you." The words hung in the room like a delicate chord, vibrating with meaning. It wasn't a bold confession or an overtly romantic declaration, it was quiet, almost casual, but the weight behind it made my pulse quicken. She didn't elaborate, didn't add commentary or judgment. She simply let the statement exist, letting me fill it with the anticipation, curiosity, and the strange thrill of being known. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the warmth in my chest and the subtle tightening in my stomach. "Oh, she did?" I murmured, keeping my voice calm, though every nerve in my body seemed alert. I could feel the faint brush of her hand as she reached to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so small, so ordinary, yet electrifying in the way it connected us. She looked at me then, directly, her eyes soft but attentive, tracing the subtle reactions flickering across my face. There was no judgment, only observation, a quiet, patient acknowledgement that left me both exposed and comforted. "Yes," she said, her voice steady but warm. "She spoke highly of you, and well, I wanted to see for myself." Her words carried a weight that was almost tangible. I felt the room close in around us, the sunlight catching the edges of her hair, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air between us. Every glance, every pause, every subtle movement felt magnified. When she shifted slightly, the faint brush of her elbow against mine sent a ripple of awareness through me, a gentle, grounding, and thrilling spark that made me simultaneously nervous and calm. I didn't expect that," I admitted, my voice quiet, unsure. There was something in the way she looked at me, patient, understanding, gently curious, that made it impossible to hide my nervousness, impossible to mask the strange mix of anticipation and hesitation I felt. She smiled, a soft, knowing smile that lingered just long enough to make me acutely aware of her presence, the warmth radiating from her, the subtle energy of someone fully attentive, fully present. "I'm glad I did," she said simply, as if the statement itself carried everything she wanted me to understand. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it was dense with unspoken acknowledgement, the quiet recognition of attraction, curiosity, and connection. In that pause, I realized that this moment, this brief confession, had shifted everything between us. The playful curiosity, the gentle touches, the lingering glances, it all converged here, in this simple, intimate exchange. And for the first time, I understood, the slow, careful, deliberate build of our connection was no longer just a possibility. It was a quiet, undeniable reality, waiting for us to navigate it, carefully, together. The room felt quieter now, as if the world outside had faded to a soft, muted haze. Sunlight filtered through the curtains in warm, slanted beams, catching the edges of her hair and illuminating the subtle expressions on her face. We had moved past small talk and casual proximity. We were here, together, in a space of honesty and quiet vulnerability, either of us rushing, both of us savoring the tension that hummed between us. She spoke softly, her voice a low murmur that seemed to blend seamlessly with the hum of the room. "Sometimes," she said, pausing as she tucked her hands around a cup of tea, "I wonder if people really see each other, or if we just imagine it." Her gaze found mine, steady and curious, and I felt the weight of her words settle into the pit of my chest. "I think," I began, uncertain, "sometimes it takes someone noticing the small things, the things nobody else sees, to really feel seen." My words sounded fragile even to me, but there was a quiet certainty in her eyes that encouraged me to keep speaking, to open up more than I normally would. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, the silence between us charged with the kind of attention that makes time feel elastic. I noticed the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders, the delicate way her fingers wrapped around the teacup, the faint warmth radiating from her skin. Every small detail seemed magnified, every breath, every glance, every pause heavy with unspoken emotion. She leaned slightly closer, enough for our knees to brush ever so softly. The contact was minor, accidental perhaps, but it sent a shiver of awareness up my spine. I realized then how acutely I felt her presence. Her proximity was no longer just comforting, it was magnetic. Her hand moved to rest briefly on the edge of my forearm as she emphasized a point, and the warmth of her touch lingered long after she drew away. "Being honest, even with yourself," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is harder than it looks. But sometimes, it's worth it." Her gaze held mine with quiet intensity, and I felt an unspoken invitation, a trust, a permission to exist fully in this moment, to allow the connection between us to deepen without fear or restraint. I responded instinctively, leaning just a little closer, matching her subtle gesture of vulnerability. My hand brushed hers, and we both froze for a heartbeat, aware of the electricity in the air. Not the kind of electricity that demands words or declarations, but the slow, steady, undeniable current of emotional intimacy, of mutual recognition and desire tempered with care. We laughed softly at something inconsequential moments later, but the laughter was layered with meaning, relief, warmth, shared understanding. I could feel the quiet trust that had blossomed between us, a delicate, tentative intimacy that promised something lasting if we nurtured it. Every glance, every touch, every shared silence had led us here, to a place where being close felt safe, meaningful, and exhilarating all at once. As the afternoon waned, I realized with startling clarity that this was no longer a casual visit, no longer a fleeting curiosity. This connection, tender, charged, unspoken, had reached a point where either of us could ignore it. The slow, deliberate journey of proximity, trust, and emotional honesty had built to this quiet climax, a moment suspended between desire and restraint, longing and understanding, where everything felt possible, and yet nothing needed to be rushed. The late afternoon sunlight had softened into a warm ember, casting long shadows across the room and painting everything in a gentle, golden hue. We had talked for hours, shared laughter and confessions, brushed hands in fleeting, electric moments, and yet the world outside seemed oblivious to the intimacy that had quietly blossomed between us. She stood at the doorway, a small package in hand, the same one she had brought earlier, now more symbolic than practical. I could see the subtle hesitation in her posture, the faint pause in her breath, as if she were savoring this final moment before stepping back into the ordinary flow of life. "I should go," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that made it impossible to sound casual. She looked at me directly, her eyes holding a quiet intensity, and I felt the weight of everything unsaid, every glance and touch, compressed into this single moment. "Right," I said, though my voice was a little unsteady. I wasn't ready to let the afternoon, or the connection, end, yet I also didn't want to rush her. There was a rhythm to this, a slow unfolding that had made everything feel meaningful. Before she stepped fully away, she reached out and placed her hand gently on my cheek. The touch was feather-light, yet it carried a depth of emotion that words could not capture. I felt the warmth of her skin, the faint pulse beneath her fingertips, and the comforting steadiness of her presence. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the room shrinking until it was only the two of us, existing entirely in the space between that delicate, perfect touch. I leaned into it instinctively, just slightly, as if acknowledging the quiet intimacy we had cultivated over the afternoon. Her hand lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I felt the steady thrum of something unspoken, a promise, a recognition, a bridge between our worlds. "I'm glad I came," she said finally, her lips curving into a gentle, genuine smile. There was no hurry in her words, no dramatics, only honesty and warmth. "I hope we can do this again." I nodded, my own smile soft but full of meaning. "I'd like that," I whispered, and in that moment I realized the true depth of what had grown between us. It wasn't just attraction or curiosity. It was understanding, trust, and a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes, the most profound connections are the ones that develop slowly, carefully, and intentionally. As she stepped out the door, the faint scent of her perfume lingered, mingling with the late summer air and leaving a gentle echo of her presence in the room. I closed the door behind her, my fingers lingering for a second on the handle, reluctant to break the spell of the afternoon. I sank back into the couch, the golden light falling across my face, and let the warmth settle into my chest. The memory of her hands, her gaze, her soft laugh, and the quiet tension of our closeness remained vivid, a gentle ache of longing mixed with satisfaction. For the first time in a long while, I felt the rare, grounding comfort of connection, the kind that lingers after the moment has passed, that reshapes ordinary life into something quietly extraordinary. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning of a story written not in grand gestures, but in small, meaningful moments that would continue to unfold, naturally and beautifully.